So it gives me a great pleasure to introduce for our keynote speaker, a very distinguished speaker indeed, Dr. Elias Zerhouni, former director of the US National Institutes of Health and now president of Global Research and Development of Sanofi in France. Elias.
Merci, Nick. Thank you. First, in French, joyeux anniversaire.
Happy birthday to DNDi.
Amazing accomplishment in 10 years. As I was thinking over lunch about the first time I heard about DNDi was actually through Tony Fauci at the NIH. I was a young director. I just started my job as director of the NIH, and he came and told me about this initiative from Médecins Sans Frontières, which I knew, and all of the other partners and how NIH could help and so on. I thought at the time, I thought that DNDi was a model that, if successful, would be a template for how actually you could carry out studies and advance the field in areas where the economics actually do not often stand in the way of being able to do something. So what I'd like to talk to you about in my keynote is not a technical approach to how we do clinical development better. What I'd like to do is share with you my point of view from having had both an academic career at Johns Hopkins when I was there, and I was head of research and executive vice dean, and then a public funder of research at the NIH, and today in private industry as the head of global R&D for Sanofi. And combining those 3 points of views, I think, could be something that will be worth sharing with you, because at the end of the day, the conclusion of my speech is going to be the following. Yes, DNDi is a great success. Yes, in 10 years it has made a change. But the real question is we need to continue to build an ecosystem around the issue of rare diseases that will have to include all players. It will be academics, or governments, or private industry, or non-profit organizations. And it's the building of that network that I'd like to address. Because without a network, what happens is that every initiative has to build its entire infrastructure, has to build its complete support network, and every initiative then becomes extremely expensive. And what happens is that the justification for it becomes harder and harder to get. And therefore, if you have an ecosystem, meaning a network of willing partners that is pre-positioned, that is developed strategically, then the cost of any new initiative becomes the marginal cost of the system, and therefore it becomes quite affordable, and it becomes transformative. I will give you an example of that, just a technical example, in clinical trials. When I was head of the National Institute of Health, we had the issue of HIV trials and many other trials, and what you find very clearly is that in clinical development, maintaining an infrastructure of clinical trial makes every single trial less expensive. And the thing that I found was that by doing that, then you could log in and add to it neglected diseases initiatives if you wanted to, or rare disease initiatives, because the marginal cost of doing that, once you had made the network structure available, was not prohibitive. So that's just an example, but let me start from the beginning. The question that we have in front of us is that neglected diseases are neglected for reasons that are embedded in our society, embedded in the globality of the issues that we're dealing with. And therefore, when you ask yourself, how are you going to modify this, you have to have what I would call thought leadership. Thought leadership is going to be essential, whether it be in academia or government or in parliaments around the world or in foundations. And the thought leadership that I think I'm talking about is the ability for us to influence policymakers, to influence decision makers across the entire system. And when I was at the NIH, it was very important to me to realize how critical it is to have patrons, leaders, in Congress, for example, leaders in various governments around the world, leaders in society that really would commit to the idea that neglected diseases actually should not be neglected. They are not so negligible. In other words, a neglected disease does not mean it's a negligible disease. And I think this idea also percolates within a company like Sanofi. And so one of the questions that people ask is always, why would you invest in neglected diseases where there's no return? And in fact, the solution and the answer is, it's really depending upon the company's behaviors is going to depend upon thought leadership within the company. So for example, at Sanofi, I know that there are very committed individuals within the company that defend actually every project within the company to become something that the company is committed to. And so if in our midst, we have thought leaders, advocates, who really speak the right language and speak the language of global responsibility. And that is essential to nurturing the ecosystem. Now you'd say, well, he's talking about propaganda about Sanofi here. Not true. The reason I give this example is because the exact same thing is the strategy, in my view, that will help clinical development. And the reason I say this is that we cannot be tactical about improving the outcome in neglected diseases. You have to be strategic. And what I mean by that is that we have to nurture an entire community of thought leaders in every component of the system necessary to execute and succeed in developing all of the solutions that we need, all the therapeutics that we need to solve the problem of neglected diseases. So I was talking about Congress and the political system. Academia is in the exact same situation. And academia and public funding are really two sides of the same coin. If the NIH does not support rare and neglected diseases or infectious diseases, nothing will work. Why is that? Because there will be no thought leadership developed within academia to feed the ranks of the thought leaders that you need in the entire system. If you didn't have the ability for you to do studies and develop knowledge, how would you convince foundations that in fact the problem is solvable? So I think amongst all of the messages that I would like to say about how do we succeed in clinical development, the first and foremost, and I hope DNDi will obviously think about both motivating but also leading the change in creating an even bigger and greater and more effective networked ecosystem around the world. I'm a very committed person to global health. I can tell you that one of the things we did best was to provide access to academic researchers to large libraries to do high throughput screening. And the reason it was successful is because we then encouraged academics to truly develop the assays, the understanding of the targets, and the development of new targets. I was very interested to see, for example, my daughter did research with James McCarrow at UCSF, and it was really exciting to see that he would direct his students to understand at the very deep biological level the targets that were present in the schistosomiasis. So what I'm trying to say is that there is no single solution to clinical development. There are tactical solutions that we can already implement today. One, for example, is the initiative that we've launched a year and a half ago, which is called Transcelerate Pharma across pharmaceutical companies, and use that as a vehicle to, in fact, enhance what I call the clinical system infrastructure around the world to be able to conduct these trials effectively with the appropriate technologies and the appropriate science behind it, such as diagnostics, such as measuring. This is a point that Nick makes a lot, having real science, real pharmacological sciences behind any of these clinical trials, and so forth. So if you really look at success stories, what you realize, and one of them is the collaboration we have with DNDi on sleeping sickness, a drug that was lying fallow in the drawers of the company, Sanofi, and then intelligent thought leaders inside and outside of the company saying there is an opportunity to do something, but frankly, nothing would have happened without external push from the system to say, let's just work together and make sure that we can develop this. And then obviously the expertise and the infrastructure that exists within a pharmaceutical company was put to good use, because it did reduce, again, the marginal cost of being able to do this development with the DNDi, and it reduced it reciprocally in a reciprocal way. Sorry. We had a nice lunch. So this, for example, is a template. How many other drugs like this lie in the drawers of many other companies is something that I think we should put as a question. We pushed, for example, at the NIH to have an initiative on repurposed drugs, and Francis Collins has launched the NCATS program, where in fact he's inviting companies to provide safe, already drugs that have gone through the safety testing. I think we should extend this to neglected and rare diseases specifically, because most of the companies responded, including our own, not providing, in fact, the drugs that would help the DNDi agenda. So if you really think about it, my view is that we need to, in the next phase, have an understanding of the neglected diseases in a much more networked way. I think the question is going to be the development of thought leaders in every component that is relevant to the success of the fight against neglected diseases. So that was my message, a general one, but it's very specific in the sense that nothing will happen either in pharma or in government or in academia or in nonprofit sector, in the nonprofit sector anywhere in the world, if we don't have an increased number of thought leaders that are committed to making their institutions move towards this open collaborations that has been already successful in many cases. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Elias. So the way we're going to structure this to ward off the postprandial torpor is that I'll ask 1 or 2 questions, and then you can ask 2 or 3 questions. I'll keep an eye on the time, and then we'll go on to each speaker. And then at the end, if there's still time, we will have all the speakers available for questions. So Elias, if I may, you make a persuasive and cogent argument for this ecosystem. Do you think that it's viable without the enabling interface of a PDP or PPP? And if it's not, what about the areas that are neglected by the neglected diseases PDPs, those areas that we're not covering? How are we going to support them?
Well, first of all, I think PDP is very important because it shows the light, it shows the direction, it shows the ability to actually get something done. Because negativism is a huge hurdle in neglected diseases, you know very well, because people say, oh, it's not possible. And that is the number one thing that the PDP does. It shows the way to the possible rather than the impossible. So I think that's role number one. The number 2 role is that indeed none of the players see this as their priority area for good reasons. That's why it's neglected. And because of that, you really need a catalyst. And the catalyst is not going to be just PDPs, obviously, but PDPs are an important component of the catalyst. Because I can tell you, I don't want to name names, but the DNDi is on my case all the time, I mean, every time, every 3 months, 6 months, I get something coming up. We need your help for a collaboration with the DNDi or MMV. And you're going to visit, Lance, you're going to visit Sanofi Pasteur. I'm sure I'm going to get an email after you visit there. That's what makes things happen. And if you don't have external factors that are not, obedient to the system, nothing changes.
And my second question, please come to the microphones if you wish to ask a question, is with your unique perspective of both industry and academia, do you think academia is sufficiently switched into all this?
No, I don't think so. I think the reason is very simple. The reason is that more and more, if you look at academic programs, they're not necessarily connected or able to have all of the components of the early research, because PDPs are not going to do this. And Big Pharma is certainly not going to do that. They're not good at that anyway. And so many times what you see is that the academic sector is oriented in a few areas. Now, I'm not saying in HIV or malaria or TB, you don't have that. But what I notice is that there's not enough critical mass in academia. So I give you an example. I don't like to just give you theoretical things, but it's a practical example. I was surprised that when I was at the NIH, the total funding for TB was less than 120 million. I'm talking about 2003. So I talked to Tony Fauci. I said, Tony, this is a shame. I mean, come on, we have to do more. We had doubled the Fogarty International Center, which is the international arm. And so we said, let's just do something bold and let's double the funding. So we doubled the funding. And you know what? It's just the same people got twice the money. And why is that? Because I said, something is wrong with this picture. Let's count the number of people who are really doing TB research in the world. And it was surprising, there were only 700 people. 700 people. So it doesn't matter about the amount of money you put in academia if they don't have the people committed to do the research. And I think that, to me, is the essential factor. How many brains are there for you to support? And I don't think there are enough in academia. I don't know if the numbers have changed. I think the last time I heard they had changed, they had improved. But that was the problem.
Yes, Nick, I hope you will permit me to ask my question in French. Sorry. Elias.
Elias, thank you very much indeed for everything you said on DND, and I'm sure that a lot of colleagues in the room here are delighted to hear your praise. One question which is linked to the rollout of clinical trials. Now, I see that as one of the really thorny topics for the future. One of the wonderful things about our future clinical development is genomics, being able to characterize more and more specifically diseases and patients, and trying to organize quicker, faster assays with more reliable outcomes. This is one of the most exciting developments which we're looking forward to, not just characterizing, for example, parasites, but characterizing the patient, him or herself. Now, when we're talking about neglected diseases, and particularly parasitis, which DNDi works on, but also malaria, now we are almost sure that we will be deprived of this possibility of having clinical trials in the future. So how can one reconcile this fantastic source of progress in the future and this difficulty which we have of not getting the patients to profit from this progress? Thank you. Thank you very much. And well, I think a lot of progress is being made by using not just genomics, but fluid mechanics. There are new, very sensitive detection techniques using proteome, for example, and all of this can now be developed and rolled out in the field. Now, this is the kind of progress which we have to work on. I fully agree that we need to have targeted clinical trials working on populations which are the most relevant populations. That really is very important indeed. The fact is that very often it's not your molecule which fails, it's the application of this molecule to the population which you have applied it to. You've got a tremendous heterogeneity which destroys the signal. So you have to have these tools in hand, but I believe that this is a role of the public funders, of the NIH, of INSERM, of the pharmaceutical industry to develop these platforms, and I believe that progress has definitely been made. I believe that in the future we could be rolling out trials for tuberculosis and malaria using specific screening tools which now exist. There's all tremendous biological advances which have been made. All this is now possible. It's all been miniaturized. It's cheaper. It can be done.
Of one of the effects of neglect. So 700 researchers in TB. The important thing is that, well, maybe 1,000. The important thing is that 30 years ago it would have been 3 times as many, or probably more. And this is an example of where over-reliance on existing tools and the fact that you're thinking that it's done, you got what you need, this was a cause of a 20-year setback for TB research. And TB, incidentally, is not one of the neglected diseases. It's called something different. So effectively, we are running the risk of saying the same thing in these diseases because there are some tools today being used, deployed, and we believe we have all we need, except that we will discover a few years from now that there's resistance and other things. So you pointed to the role of a number of actors, including PDPs, in keeping people alerted about that, and that would be very important as well.
Yeah, the point I was making about tuberculosis was that if the situation is like that in tuberculosis, imagine what it is in neglected diseases. So I started, because I'm so interested in this, I looked at all of the labs in the US, and they were involved in true good research in neglected diseases, and I didn't find that number to be very impressive, and that's why I responded that I didn't think academia had enough critical mass at this point in time, and we need to build this critical mass more around the world. That was my point. On the other hand, I think it's absolutely obvious that as we think on a going forward basis, that you will need that critical mass in every component of the ecosystem. If we didn't have 130 people who are committed to infectious diseases at Sanofi, and then Sanofi Pasteur, with people who every day believe in what they do, I don't think this company would have supported my support of these initiatives, from which I get harassing phone calls every few months. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elias.